What up, Wizards? It's Dev, and it is also finally time because after almost a year of teasing it in every third video, the mono green cube is done, and I'm ready to show it to you. Now, last year when we did the mono black cube, I had more fun than I've ever had as a content creator or a Magic player, right? So I figured I had such a blast, we'd do it all over again. I asked Twitter, or whatever you're supposed to call it now, what monocolored cube do you all want to see next? And a large majority of them all said green, which leads us to the present, where we have a somewhat budget-focused 180 card cube, perfect for exactly 4 players to draft. Now, we'll definitely go into some detail about the individual card choices and the archetypes contained within the cube as we move through the cards themselves, but just before we get into it, broad strokes here, I want you to know it was much harder to create and balance a mono green cube than it was a mono black cube, right? Mono black has all the best removal, which is a crucial component to a limited environment, whereas green, well, you know. And with all that said, I should point out that far more planning and especially testing was put into the creation of this cube than the last cube. Way more time and bottom line effort was put into bringing you this project than the mono black cube. And on that note, one last thing before we jump in. These projects are very much a labor of love. They typically get far fewer views than my standard or even commander content, but I just have such a good time doing them that I'm going to keep doing them. That said, I also don't get like an affiliate link or anything for these. Now, there is a list in the description if you want to check it out on Cube Cobra, but I'm not taking their money to hawk their name or anything. And again, I'm not making any money when you buy these cards. So all that said, if you did want to help out, the best way to do it is to either check out the Patreon, link in the description. We got some stuff over there for you, or you can just leave a tip down there in the comments section, which is always greatly appreciated. All that said, just as long as you're here, I'm happy that you're here. But I'm emotionally done with this part of the video, and the thing that I want to do the absolute most in the world is present this cube to you because I am very proud of it. So let's go on. All right, let's get it. We'll go in curve order, starting with the 1-drops here. There are 20 of them in this cube, and we'll begin with one of the most iconic cards in Magic history. That is Lawnmower Elf, as we used to call it back in the day. Larry the Lawnmower Elf is obviously a wonderful piece of ramp, and most green decks will want it. That's why there's 2 of them in the cube, actually. We got Finhorn Elves in here as well from Ice Age. This is effectively just a Lawnmower Elf, so sometimes a player is going to end up with 2 copies of them and have a very nice day. Apart from that, though, we get into a promo Experiment 1 here for the Stompy decks. Anything that's playing an increasingly larger creature every turn is probably going to want an Experiment 1 as their 1-drop. Apart from that, we've got Ascendant Pack Leader, another good card for the Stompy decks, or any deck that's just looking to get on board with a decently powerful creature in the early game. This is a great 1-drop for just about any deck. Apart from that, Scrib Sprites is up next. Looks a little bit weird, but it is an iconic card from the old days of Magic, but it's also a signifier for a flying deck. In this environment, you don't see a lot of green flying creatures, but that said, we tried to include just enough that you could actually make flying an archetype, just like you can in a lot of other draft environments. And Scrib Sprites is the first evidence of that. We've also got Generous Visitor in here. Speaking of archetypes, there's also an enchantments-based archetype in this limited environment, and Generous Visitor is our first clue of that as well. You're going to want this card if you want to play enchantments, and there's a lot of good enchantments in the environment. Teething Wormlet is a signal for an artifacts-based deck. There is a total of 22 colorless artifacts in this deck, plus a few artifacts that actually are green. We'll get to those as we move on. So on curve, you can make a pretty decent Teething Wormlet deck too. There's also Essence Warden. Mono green lifelink or life gain is not necessarily supported so much in this cube, but what is elves, and Essence Warden is very good at getting you a bunch of life when you're playing all of them elves. This one looks a little bit beat up, but that's actually one of my favorite things about it. I love cards that look like this, and you may see 1 or 2 as we move through here. There's also Tajuru Blightblade, just a 1-mana 1 with Death Touch. That is also an elf, so if you're building elves, it's pretty decent in that, but Death Touch is also a supported archetype in this cube, as we see with Fang of Shigeki, just another 1/1 Death Touch. But this, just like Tajuru Blightblade, does a little bit more than just be a Death Touch guy. It's also got a relevant creature type. This has a relevant card type, being an enchantment. So in your Generous Visitor deck or other Enchantress deck, deck. It's a creature that will sometimes draw you a card or put a +1/+1 counter on something. You want that. Swarm Shambler is also in this deck. One of the last 1-drop creatures, if memory serves. This is good for +1/+1 counters decks, which basically have to be a supported archetype if you're doing a mono green cube. There's also Hardened Scales. Talk about support for +1/+1 counters. This is just about the best support you can possibly imagine for a deck like that. Wild Growth is also in here. Again, Ramp needs to be not only a supported archetype, but it just needs to be something that multiple players can get their hands on, because it's one of the things that green does the best. So it shouldn't necessarily even be locked in to one archetype. Like, I'm the Ramp player at the table. In this cube, based on my experience testing at least, multiple players will grab multiple Ramp pieces. You'll be getting fast mana in just about everyone's deck. There's also many pairings in here, so this is a Lay of the Land effect that also creates a food token. So 1 mana, go get a land, also make a food token. Food is yet another supported archetype in this environment. So as you can see, we're kind of rapid fire going through these different archetypes as we just go through the 1-drops. But that's one of the things I wanted to do in this cube, is make sure that all the way down to the 1-drops, the proper archetypes are supported. And there's not a whole lot of wasted cards in this thing. We only get 180 slots. It's not as many as you may think. There's also Snakeskin Veil, pretty good catch-all card against removal and other things that may want to target your guys. Snakeskin Veil is one of the better, removal counter spells in the history of Magic, and it also does some good work in +1/+1 counter decks. Tail Swipe is in here, a removal spell. We have to work in just about as many of these as we possibly can. Tail Swipe is not a bad one. Just about any of these that cost a single mana are going to be relatively playable. Like Hard-Hitting Question here, which is just about one of the better 1 mana, bite or fight spells ever printed. So definitely playing that in here. Elven Palisade is actually one of the more interesting, to my mind at least, includes in the 1-drops, if not the entire cube. This is just 1 mana. For an enchantment, sacrifice a forest, target attacking creature gets -3/-0 till end of turn. I really wanted to really support some sort of Turbo Fog archetype with Spore Frog and Fog itself, perhaps Respite or Moment of Peace and other fog effects, but I found that was really jamming up the cube with subpar cards, and there weren't a ton of ways to get them back from the graveyard properly, right? A lot of our cards in green say return permanents from graveyard to hand, and some of the cards that return anything from your graveyard to your hand are either too powerful or too slow. Well, conversely, they could be bad or too good. So it was kind of hard balancing for Turbo Fog, and in the end, I ended up cutting the deck as a supported archetype, but Palisade remained in because I actually think it's a really interesting card, and there's multiple ways to kind of cheese it in the cube. There's also Rancor, perhaps the best 1-mana aura ever printed in the history of Magic. It does have some company, like Ethereal Armor is pretty good, right? But when it comes right down to it, these Enchantress decks want Rancor for multiple reasons, right? If you have Enchantress Presence and other things like that in play, you'll draw cards when you play your Rancor. That's really, really good. But just the fact that it's a single green mana for +2/+0 and trample also make sure all your huge green dudes get through with trample, and even if they die, you can still trample over with more stuff. Rancor is a ridiculous aura. It's one of the better cards in the cube. Giant Growth is also in here, the final card in the 1-drop slot. Talk about iconic, right? If you're going to build a mono green cube, I feel like you definitely need to make room for this. Now, there are far more 2-drops than anything else in the cube, but that's how your cube, I don't want to say should be balanced. It all depends on what you're doing. But for the most part, people are looking for more 2-drops than anything else in their curves. So we have to be pretty generous with those 2s. I think we have been here. We've also got access to some extremely powerful cards in the 2-drop slot. Pretty good evidence for that, the theory, is Priest of Titania right here. If you are playing elves, this is going to produce a ridiculous amount of mana for you if you can get enough elves out. And enough elves is 2 or 3. You really don't need that many to turn this into a really broken Magic card for elves. There's also Elvish Visionary while we're talking about elves. This is not one of the best elves of all time, but it is one of the best utility creatures of all times in its own right, so it has to be in here. There's also Elvish Archer. This is actually one of the softest slots in the entire cube, but I have a soft spot for this soft slot because this is actually one of the cards that I loved the most when I first started playing Magic. And if you talk to other old timers and boomers like me, a lot of us used to love this card back in the day, if only because it looks so cool. But in any case, it's a 2-mana 2/1 first strike elf, and that's actually not terrible. You'll find use for those stats some of the time. We've also got Solana Ledgewalker, another elf in here, but this one is supporting a sort of Bogles archetype, right? It's going to be hard to actually get this off of the table. And apart from that, you can also load it up with auras and whatnot to make it huge, and it's going to be tough to actually block. So really, really sweet creature here for those, whatever you want to call them, Voltron, build your own battleship, Bogles, whatever. I want that archetype to be somewhat, although not too intensely, supported. Apart from that, there's Gala Greeters in here. This starts a chain of creatures that are kind of like it. Things that grow when you play other creatures or do something when you play other creatures. Gala Greeters gives us some life. It can make treasure, which is really, really important. Or it can just get larger as the game goes on. I think this is a pretty good creature to have in just about any green deck, but so is Kyrion Beastcaller. This doesn't gain life or ramp or anything, but it just does always get a little bit larger if you play large dudes, and there's not a whole lot of exile or anything like that in this format, obviously, that we're playing, so this will almost always pass its counters on to something else, and that's pretty sweet when you can actually pop that ability off. Kyrion Beastcaller is a great Magic card. And finally, in this little trio of cards that are kind of like one another, is Sharp-Eyed Rookie. This won't ramp and it won't gain life, just like Kyrion Beastcaller, it will get larger. It's not passing its counters down to anything, but it is drawing you some cards. Sort of, the Investigates, right? Which will also count for Teething Wormlets and other cards that care about artifacts, so keep that in mind too. This has a couple of different places it can go, but it's just a solid creature too. There's also Sakura Tribe Elder, always going to be in some ways an underrated card, even though everyone knows how good it is, right? If you've never experienced the block with Sakura Tribe Elder, sack it for a land, a phenomenon, then you haven't been frustrated enough by a game of Magic. This is just 2 mana to ramp a card on a body, ramp a land on a body, and that is ridiculous. I'm telling you. So everyone knows how good Elder is. But there's also Wall of Roots, a huge budded wall that can block for a bunch of turns while also providing ramp. Excellent card from Mirage here. Poison Dart Frog is in the cube, man. This is a 2-mana 1/1 reach, so it can block the flyers in the flying deck, but it also taps for mana of any color, so 2-mana dork that ramps that also gets Death Touch, which will matter, of course, in the Death Touch deck. So this is doing a bunch of stuff in the cube. We've got Bramble Familiar in here. The dorks go on, right? This is not only a dork that can tap for green, but can do a couple of things, right? You can return it to your hand and then use the Fetch Quest mode on it, even if you played it as a mana dork. But Fetch Quest is particularly broken in cube because it can get just about anything for you and just slam it onto the table. There's also Flourishing Bloomkin, an extremely strong card in all the testing that we did. This never left the cube, and we never wanted to cut it from the cube. This is a 2-mana 6/6 in a whole lot of games. Turns out that you get down to fighting in the trenches in a ton of these games in mono green cube, where you're just looking to go larger than your opponent or draw the overrun effect or whatever it is. And in the meantime, Flourishing Bloomkin can get huge in those stalemates and be one of the better creatures, rate-wise at least, in the entire cube. So yes, my advice is to draft this when you get it. But Werewolf Pack Leader is also in here, just a 2-mana 3/3 that's capable of drawing cards and sort of pumping itself and gaining trample. Just very solid for the mana that you're putting into it. It's one of the beefiest 2-drops of all time in green. There's also Dragon's Guard Elite. This is one of my favorite cards in this cube. We're doing something very different with this than we are with a lot of green 2-drops. This has Magecraft and gets a counter whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. There's not a whole lot of cards in this cube that incentivize casting instants and sorceries, but this one does, and if you have enough ramp, it can also get huge just through its activated ability. I've really had a lot of fun messing around with this in cube, and I wouldn't change it for the world. It's a fun card here. There's also Tough Cookie. Now this, again, for the Teething Wormlets decks, is a great 2-drop, but it's also just a good utility 2-drop for just about anything, right? It's good for the artifact-based decks, obviously, but it can do work in a lot of decks. There's Emerald Dragonfly, just like Scrib Sprites. This looks a little bit, do you say Scribe Sprites or Scrib Sprites? The age-old debate. But just like that card, this is, just a 1/1 flyer. It doesn't look too amazing. It can gain first strike until end of turn, which isn't the best thing in the world, but if you've got some auras on it or you've pumped its power in some way, it can be relevant. I just said it's not the best looking card in the world, but it is. This Quentin Hoover art is gorgeous, which is part of the reason it's still in this cube, but the big reason is that it supports this flying archetype, which is basically pseudo unblockable in this cube. There's also Jor-El, Monvuli Recluse. This is another one of my favorite cards in the cube. That was one of my favorite cards before it even went into the cube. You know, this is another one that in a way prioritizes playing green in a way that we don't normally play green, right? If you're drawing cards, then you're making cats. It's also got this monstrous activated ability, but this is just going to put an extra cat on the table for you nearly every turn if you're doing it right. And as we've discussed, that's going to be really good in these stalemates. I really like Jor-El. There's also Scavenging Ooze in here, a classic Magic card. But if anybody's trying to do graveyard shenanigans, this will stop them in their tracks while also becoming a relatively large card. Even if you're not, someone's not planning on doing graveyard shenanigans, just eating the creatures that die in combat and making your Ooze larger is a pretty important thing to be able to do. Wall of Blossoms is in this deck, kind of like an Elvis Visionary, but it's got a much larger butt, draws cards, but doesn't have a relevant creature type. Who cares? This will block a ton of stuff and draw you a card. It's a good Magic card. Unseen Walker. This was actually in a poll on Twitter. I was wondering if I should take this card out of the cube for being slightly too powerful. But at the end of the day, I did not. This is a game ender, though. Listen up. 2 mana for a 1/1 Dryad from Mirage. This has Forest Walk, and you can also pump 3 mana into it to give a creature Forest Walk till end of turn. So this is effectively unblockable all the time, no matter what, more or less. But the ability to give, 1 or 2 other creatures effective unblockability in a turn is, again, just a game-threatening, must kill it right now sort of thing. So this has been a very, very powerful card in Cube. And again, it's kind of a kill-on-sight sort of thing. Or win the game on site, so you don't have to deal with it once they pump all their mana into it. But, they can play it on 5 mana and get in their 7/7 guaranteed that very same turn if they top deck it. There's just so many powerful things about this card, but it's exactly the kind of card I like to have in a cube like this. It's not going to see play more or less anywhere else ever in Magic history, but in this cube, it is very OP, and I sort of like that about it. So let's give it its chance to be a good Magic card. Apart from that, Kami of Transience is obviously going to help out the Enchantress and Enchantments based decks in this environment. Let's play that. We've got Underdark Basilisk in here. This is just a 2 mana 1/2 Death Touch, so again, helping out the Death Touch deck. You'll see very soon why we need that support. As a matter of fact, you'll see it right now. This is Finn the Fangbearer, sent to me, signed by a superfan actual cat lady right here. I keep this and all the other signed cards that have been sent to me in my heart, and you, my friend, have made it into the Mono Green Cube video with your very, very kind and generous contribution of a signed Finn the Fangbearer here. This is the signpost for Death Touch. If you draft a bunch of Death Touch creatures but don't end up with Finn, you're probably still going to do okay, right? Because your creatures basically have a removal mode on them, but you probably still, I have to say, did not do it right. You've got to have Finn to make the Death Touch deck really tick, but once you do have him, my friend, then you're probably in the money, man. It is really, really difficult to deal with a bunch of small Death Touchers, even if you have a ton of 7 mana creatures out. You're scared of a mouse, right? And Finn is a great signpost for an archetype like that. Death Touch is one of my favorite archetypes in this cube. I've played it a few times, drafting it up and testing it, and it never fails to entertain, if nothing else. So Finn the Fangbearer, love you, buddy. There's also Ambush Viper while we're on Death Touch, guys. This is kind of a removal spell because you can play it for just 2 mana with Flash and Death Touch something on blocks, right? But it's also a 2 mana, 2 power Death Toucher, which is not the worst rate in the entire world. So not only is it going to go in the Death Touch deck, but this is a quickly drafted card, even when players are not on the Finn the Fangbearer deck, because again, it's just effectively a removal spell for all intents and purposes. Ram Through is here. This is, in fact, a removal spell for every intent and purposes, and one of the best of all time. There's also Boxing Ring, another effective removal spell here that also ramps us potentially once per turn, which is a great thing to have access to. Boxing Ring is a pseudo-broken card. Hunter's Talent, again, pseudo-broken card. This is not only a removal spell, but it's also a thing to make your dudes larger like every combat, right? Like you can draw cards off of it. Hunter's Talent is a house. You want to draft this card. Cosmic Hunger is another removal spell. there's really not like any battles in here, but it's basically like a ram through or a removal spell like it. You'll take it. Master's Rebuke is in here. As we see more removal, we need those cards. Rabid Bite is in here. Classic bite effect. That's why we call them bite effects. Did you know that? Inscription of Abundance is in here. This again is another one of these fight effects, but this is going to produce a little bit more value on occasion than just fight a guy, right? We want our fight spells to be interesting from time to time. Abundance is good for the +1/+1 counter decks and yada yada. Just a fine magic card. Savage Punch will fight things, and it cares if we have a creature power 4 or greater. Feral Encounter is in here. This will occasionally draw us a creature while fighting something. That's nice. We've got Fall of Gil-galad in here. Yet another fight effect that also scries. It puts counters on stuff, but if it's around on that third turn and we have a decent creature, then again, fights. All of, I guess we'll fight some stuff. Why not? So we'll also get to draw stuff if that creature dies. Utopia Vow is in here. Not a fight effect, but kind of a pacifism effect. If we don't mind giving our opponents some ramp, that'll be something that we really don't mind doing, I promise you, on many occasions. Lignify is also in here, another sort of pacifism effect. It takes away all of the creature's abilities and makes it a 0/4. It still may have like counters and stuff on it, making it slightly larger, but it will be mostly removed as a threat, attacking in combat, which is what you're looking for. There's also Plummet in here, sort of a removal spell, pretty good against the flying decks, right? But, you'll play in your sideboard. Quintessential sideboard card in like sealed and draft. Why in that now? There's also Seal of Primordium in here, one of the few disenchant effects at the 2 mana slot. Why not take that? It too is an enchantment, by the way, so this will trigger your Enchantress effects. Why not play that card? Naturalize is in here. Very classic Magic card, right? But it definitely gets the job done. Rampant Growth from Mirage, and to be honest, a bunch of other sets is in here. Classic ramp, just goes and gets a forest for us. Glimpse the Core is in here. This goes and gets a forest for us as well. It's more or less another rampant growth, right? Fertile Ground is in here, kind of another wild growth. You'll pay 2 mana for this effect. You won't be as happy about it as paying 1 mana for it, but you'll do it. I promise you will. There's also Gia's Touch in this deck, man. Gaia's Touch is another card that I've considered taking out for potentially being too broken, but that's mostly because of how it looks. In testing, this card has not actually been that broken, but for just 2 mana, this is an enchantment that allows you to play another forest every single turn, and you can sack this for 2 green mana, which is potentially extremely busted, right? That seems very, very good, especially in landfall decks, but it's just ramp in general, period, and that's fantastic. But again, this card has not been as broken as I expected it to be in testing, so it remains in the cube despite my best judgment, to be honest. Right? But this is a very powerful Magic card. Trail of Crumbs is in here, mostly to support the food archetype, obviously, but even decks that aren't food can play this card, right? Because it gives you a little bit of effective card selection, which is definitely something that you want in green. There's also Curious Pair. This is just food supporting, as I don't know that it does too much else. Welcome to Sweet Tooth is in here. This also supports food, but it makes a creature token as well. It's an enchantment. There's going to be some Enchantress decks that want to play this card. Regrowth is in here. Regrowth. This is maybe, in some ways, one of the best cards in the entire cube. And there's almost no reason not to draft it the moment you see it, unless there's just somehow an even larger bomb in the pack. But Regrowth, you will almost always find room for in any Magic the Gathering deck. So, yeah, that art is still beautiful, isn't it? Doesn't Regrowth still look like an amazing Magic card? Anyway, Ranger class is up next. So this will put a 2/2 into play immediately for the 2 mana and an enchantment for that matter. And for just another 2 mana, we can turn it into a +1/+1 counter every single turn, so long as we're attacking. It's also got another mode on it, and that's, not bad. It's effective, it puts an 8th card in our hand in some ways, so we can just cast creature spells from the top. So this card does everything, and you should probably draft it too. Up the Beanstalk is in here. There's obviously a lot of expensive cards in green, so let's draw some cards. Pretty good little mid-range engine. I shouldn't have to tell you that. Roaring Earth is the first real signpost that we've gotten for landfall, but it will not be the last. Just remember that landfall is a decent archetype in this cube. Season of Growth is in here for the enchantments decks, right? But it's also for the creatures decks. It's decent for Bogle's decks because you get to draw cards if you target stuff with a Snakeskin Veil or a Giant Growth, so keep that in mind. But mostly it's an enchantment that lets you scry whenever creatures come into play, and that's just a solid effect. There's also Sylvan Anthem in here, the final card in the green 2-drops. This is 2 mana to give all your green creatures +1/+1, and that may lopside things just enough. But just like Season of Growth, it's also got a scry ability on it whenever a creature comes into play, whenever a green creature comes into play. But aside from a very few creatures in this cube, they're all green. So it should be a scry 1 whenever you play darn near anything, right? So Sylvan Anthem's just a solid little card to have access to. Now, moving to the 3-drops here, there are 30 of these, so more than the 1-drops, but quite a bit fewer than the 2-drops. That said, this is where the card quality in some ways takes a real step up, because this is where all of our giants start coming in. Like a literal giant, Yorva, right here. This is just a 4-mana 4/4 that cares about +1/+1 counters, and a lot of decks will in this environment. Scrap Shooter is in here, a 3-mana 4/4 that can blow up artifacts and enchantments. Very important ability to have in this environment. There's also Venduran Enchantress. This starts a run of Enchantress creatures. This is the OG one, and she's very pretty. She'll draw a card whenever an enchantment comes into play on our side. But there's also, it's actually, yeah, it is for us. I'm just making sure. Anyway, Cetessan Champion is also in here. This is in a lot of ways a stripped upgrade on Venduran Enchantress, but that's great, right? We'll take one that gets larger and draws cards, but there's also, you have a Maya Enchantress. This one doesn't draw cards, but it does get larger. So Cetessan Champion, again, is the best of these for the most part, but still, you have a Maya Enchantress, can get very, very large, and this one does not only count your enchantments, it also counts your opponents, so it can get very, very big before it's all said and done. Imperious Perfect is in here. This is just good for the Elves decks. This starts a run of cards that are good for the Elves decks, and this one can also put more elves into play, but Elvish Archdruid is inarguably also a good card for elves. Yet another Anthem effect, and just like Priest of Titania, this one taps for a ton of mana. Rishkar is in here. This is an elf, good in those decks, but it's also good in not only the +1/+1 counters decks, but another angle is that it's good in ramp decks, because if you have creatures, it can make them tap for mana, so long as they have +1/+1 counters, which he provides. So this is good. It meets at the crossroads of a few different archetypes in this environment. It's a good little glue card to have. There's also Wood Elves in here, an elf that ramps, and, there's forests in your deck, I promise you. Apart from that, there's Reclamation Sage, a little bit like Scrap Shooter, but a little bit smaller as well. That said, you don't have to gift them anything to Rec Sage. There's also Steel Leaf Champion. While we're on elves, we might as well show you basically the biggest one in here. If you can ramp into this on 2, it's going to be hard to catch up with that. Deathbloom Gardener is in here. This is an elf, but it also is ramp, and it also has Death Touch. You'll see that I really, really like to support multiple archetypes with one card, and Gardener does a pretty good job of that. There's also Mwanvuli Beast Tracker. This can go and get a creature with nearly any relevant keyword ability. Death Touch for the Death Touch decks, Hexproof for the Bogles decks, Reach, Trample, any of those abilities, you can just go search for it and then put the card on top of your library. It doesn't put the card in your hand, which kind of sucks, but these kind of tutors in an environment like this are very, very good, and this one comes on a body. There's also Peregrine Took here for the food decks. If one or more tokens would be created under your control, you get those tokens and an additional food tokens. You can sacrifice 3 foods to draw a card. Honestly, sometimes the best thing the food deck can do is just draw cards off of Took. And that's fine. Not the most powerhousey dude in the world, but even in just like tokens decks that don't care that much about food, you're at least getting extra tokens off of Took, so you might as well put them in your deck. There's also Eternal Witness, this fancy version of it right here. Again, one of the more powerful cards at the end of the day in the entire cube. If you have Regrowth and Eternal Witness, you have formed the core of that Fog deck that I was talking about having cut earlier in this video. I did cut the Fog deck, but obviously I got to leave in Regrowth and Eternal Witness. E-Witness is good in basically everything. You should draft her. Champion of Lambbolt is up next. This is another one that gets larger the more things you play, just like a lot of the 2-drops that we looked at, but this one has a super special extra ability that lets it go more or less completely unblocked once it gets large enough, and this can win a lot of games by itself. There's also Quandrix Pledge Mage, which does have blue technically in the mana symbols, but you're paying Simic hybrids for this, meaning that it's still mono green, right? You pay 1 green for this. But this has Magecraft, where it gets a +1/+1 counter when you cast a caster copy an instant or sorcery. So it's a little bit like, one of the cards that we looked at in the 2-drop slot. It's a lot like that card, actually. So you can kind of build an honest-to-God spell-slinging deck between, Jorial and this and Dragon Master Outcast. It's not Outcast, that's a red card. I always forget the name of it, but the other 2-drop that grows when you Magecraft. And that's a really, really fun archetype in this environment, because you just don't expect to see mono green spell slinger, but you can do it based on just a few, 1 to 3 drop cards. Killer Bees is also in here, a cornerstone for the flying deck in limited, but honestly, this is another one where if you're not building the flying deck, you still just want to draft Killer Bees. It takes a lot of mana. It's extremely intensive to get some damage in with this, but it's also a game-winning card that's relatively tough to answer over the course of a few turns. The biggest weakness for Killer Bees is that nearly anything can fight it and kill it. You don't even have to have a bite effect, just fight it. And if your opponent doesn't have enough open mana, you kill it. If they do have a bunch of open mana, you force them to spend it, which is a whole other thing in its own right. But still, even with some of its weaknesses, Killer Bees is a game-winning card. It's been winning games since 1994. A lot of us old heads, ask any of us, can tell you how much love we have for Killer Bees as a Magic card. It's a lot of us have a spot in our heart for this, but turns out in the limited environment, especially one like this is a heartbreaker of a Magic card. There's also Unyaru Bees if you wanted another Killer Bees effect. This costs 3 green mana, but who cares? We've got it. We're mono green, right? This, just like Killer Bees, is a 0/1 flyer that you can pump. You can fire breathe, right? Pump +1/+1 for a single green, but you can also sacrifice this and cast Unyaru Sting, right? You can deal 2 damage to a target in this case. Which is just, again, like a removal spell. So Killer Bees on a removal spell is even better than straight up Killer Bees. So draft these guys when you get a chance, is I guess what I'm getting around to. Hornet Nest is also in here, pretty sweet for the Death Touch decks, but it's also really good for the flying decks. Basically, when this dies, because you blocked with it in combat, then you get a ton of 1/1, flying Death Touch guys. Basically, when it takes damage, you get that many 1/1 flying guys. So if you have a way of dealing A damage to it, then you can put a bunch of tokens out turn over turn. But mostly you want to dare your opponent to swing with a 6/6 and give you 6 Hornets, right? This card is devastating on occasion, and very scary to actually swing into. Kodama's Reach is in here because of course it is. What's next? Cultivate? Yes, actually Cultivate. Cultivate is, in fact, the next card. These are both just really good ramp pieces, very similar to one another, obviously. Vow of Wildness is in here. Do you know what this is? This is an enchant creature that's also a removal spell. So the creature has +3/+3, has trample, and cannot attack you or a planeswalker you control. So if you slap it on one of your dudes, you're not attacking you, right? So in your Enchantress deck or whatever, this is +3/+3 and trample on what is normally an already large creature, because your Yavimaya Enchantress or whatever is huge at this point. I'll give it trample and win the game. But if you have to, you can shut down one of your opponent's creatures as well with this thing. But be very careful with it, is all I'm going to say, because they can still block with it. Song of the Dryads is in here as well. Maybe one of the best green removal spells literally ever printed. Sure, they get a little bit of ramp out of it. They get a forest, but they what they don't have is a creature. So you'll take that most of the time. This is a sweet little pacifism. Stew the Conies is in here. This is a fight effect that gives you food, so you'll play it in the food decks. You'll also just sometimes play it because you want it. Beast Within is the other best green removal spell of all time. Sure, it gives them a 3/3, but they don't have a 4/4 anymore. You see how that's better? Yeah, it is. It also just blows up any permanent, which you want. Fight Rigging is in here. This has a decent hideaway ability on it, but if nothing else, it just makes your dudes larger every single turn. You'll take that. Garrick's Uprising is in here, so you can draw some cards off of your big guys. I heard you like to do that. Enchantress's Presence is in here, so you can draw some cards off of your enchantments. I know you like to do that. There's a couple of other cards in the 3-drops that that do that. So that's why, what's another one? And then the final 3-drop card in the cube is Ancestral Mask. We're doing a lot of work for the Enchantress deck in the 3-drop slot. This is enchanted creature gets +2/+2 for each other enchantment in play. This also includes your opponent's enchantments. Keep that in mind. But if you only have like 3 enchantments in play, period, apart from Ancestral Mask, it's frustrating that it doesn't count itself. But it's pretty easy to have like Rancor, Enchantress's Presence, one other aura, right? And then your creature gets +6/+6 at least. Absolutely bonkers card for making creatures much larger than can be handled, right? So you'll definitely play this in Enchantress to kind of end the game effectively. It goes very well with a Rancor giving the dude trample. Now, there are 24 drops in this cube, which I'm still not convinced is enough even to this day, but it is enough for everyone to get an average of 5 4-drops that they can play in their deck if they want to play them all. I think that's more than enough for the most part in the limited environment. So let's flip these over and look at Eidolon of Blossoms, mostly because I want to continue with the Enchantress support, which you will see far less of from here on out, but Eidolon of Blossoms is obviously a great little magic card for drawing cards. Apart from that, we've got Beast Whisperer. Speaking of drawing cards, right? This is maybe the best source of card draw in the entire cube, and I don't know that I have ever seen this card anything but first picked. Right? Like, I've always first picked it. I've had other people be like, ooh, Beast Whisperer. Like, they'll announce that they got Beast Whisperer in their pack. It is just one of the more first pickable cards in the entire cube. Nightpack Ambusher is in here. So there is a slight wolf and werewolf sub-theme. We've already seen a couple of wolves. There's no werewolves because I don't want transform cards. I just don't like flippable cards, period. On a personal level, I don't enjoy those. I don't like reaching into sleeves in the middle of a game and flipping the card and then flipping it back over. That's stupid. But anyway, enough of my personal preferences. First of all, a 4-mana 4/4 flash is decent in and of itself. But again, we've already seen some wolves. We'll see a couple of more before the night is over here. So this is kind of an anthem effect for the wolves. Apart from that, just makes wolves every turn, if you want to do that, or if you drew a land that turn or whatever. So just a more than solid card here that will help you make bodies as the game goes on. It can also just be used as an ambusher, literally, to cast it as a removal spell effectively. Yeva, Nature's Herald, is also in here. Speaking of flash, this combos pretty well with the Nightpack Ambusher because it makes sure the Ambusher more or less always gives you a creature on your turn. You can wait until your opponent's turn to cast, your creatures with flash now. So really, again, like the dimension this brings to mono green, and it gives it an ability it doesn't always have. Canopy Tactician, this is yet another anthem effect for the elves that also just taps for 3. That's not going to be as much as Priest of Titania or, whatever, the 3-drop Archdruid some of the time, but other times it'll be more. I feel like 3 mana is a pretty good deal most of the time. Elvish Piper is in here, so this is gross. This is a well-remembered card from way back in Urza's Destiny, but this one, I wanted the Rebecca Gay art from 9th edition because it's so gorgeous. This is a beautiful magic card. This is also, in some ways, one of the more expensive cards in the whole cube at like $3, but it's got to be in here, man. It's just such a nasty thing to be able to drop anything from your hand into play. Okam Adversary. I was talking about the Forest Walk Lady earlier, which is it's Unseen Walker, but everyone that I've tested with calls her the Forest Walk Lady. How good she is in this cube and how bad she is most other places. Okam Adversary, pretty similar, This saw some sideboard play when it was in Standard, but it probably won't see play just about anywhere else for the rest of time. But in this cube, it's insane. This says 4 mana, but it costs 2 less to cast as long as an opponent controls a green permanent. So what you're actually looking at here is a 2 mana 2/3 Death Touch that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, which is an unbelievable deal for a Magic card. So amazing in this cube, drafted more or less every time you see it. Renata, Called to the Hunt's in here. So the power is equal to your devotion to green, and pretty good in the +1/+1 counters deck because any creature you play after this just automatically enters with a counter on it. Pretty slick, man. Locust Swarm is in here. A cuttable, I think, card from this cube, but also a really annoying blocker and good card for the flying deck. This is a 1/1 flyer that regenerates, and you can untap it. So you can fly in with it, pay a green to untap it, and leave it up for blocks, pay a green to regenerate it. And basically, they don't get to get through with their largest creature so long as it doesn't have trample. Pretty gross card, actually. Better than it looks. by a mile. Yavimaya Ants is also in here. Got to support the boomers just a little bit. A lot of us also have very fond memories of Yavimaya Ants. This is a green ball lightning that can actually stick around if you're willing to pay the cumulative upkeep. And again, it has trample, so any anthems or ways of making it larger are much appreciated. Turns out 4 mana for 5 power with trample is something you will gladly pay for. Stampeding Wildebeest. This is an underappreciated older card from Visions that some will have pretty good memories of and others will have never heard of, even if they played back then. Now, this is a 4 mana 5 power trample guy, which is great. What's the downside? Well, during your upkeep, you have to return a green creature you control to your hand or its owner's hand. This looks like a downside, and sure, it takes extra mana, but you get the ETB trigger on whatever creature you're bouncing back to your hand all over again, and if it's a particularly good ETB trigger, that's amazing. But even if you're just bouncing Elvish Visionary and drawing another card, or maybe you have a Beast Whisperer in play, so you bounce your Llanowar Elves, you play it again, you draw a card off Whisperer, this is all really, really good. And again, this is a trample guy. So, yes. And also, you get this awesome Randy Galagos art. It's fantastic. Questing Beast is in here. This takes too long to read. It does everything. Let's just leave it at that. It's one of the best green 4-drops ever printed. Wicked Wolf is in here for the food decks, but this is also just a removal spell. So, in my experience, this gets drafted by the first player that sees it more often than not. If that happens to be you and you want to play some food, make sure you get it before anybody else, because removal spell on a body is crazy. A Necrotal in mono green is ridiculous. There's also Provisions Merchant while we're on food stuff. This is a way to make your dudes a little bit larger and gain trample, which is especially important in your food deck and help put the game away. But it's also Knight of Sweet's Revenge, which is the actual payoff, the real payoff for food decks. You've got Peregrine Took, you've got Provisions Merchant, you've even got a couple of other cards that pay you off for playing food, but Knight of Sweet's Revenge is by far the absolute best of all of them, and it's the only reason that the food archetype subtype really in this cube remains. There's also Roots, 4 mana for technically a removal spell. It taps a creature down and the creature does not untap. So this is 4 mana at sorcery speed. That's a lot, but it is going to trigger any enchantress effects or anything like that, and you'd be surprised the premium you'll pay for removal in mono green. Explosive Vegetation is in here along with Migration Path. These are effectively the same card, but Migration Path can cycle, so it's a little bit better, but good for ramp decks and landfall decks alike. There's Might of Oaks in here, one of my favorite cards from the old days. This one's from Urza's Legacy. It's got the big squirrel art, the best art for Might of Oaks ever printed, but it's still +7/+7 at instant speed. May not feel like it's worth 4 mana some of the time, but what it does is it gets an unblocked Llanowar Elf in for 8 and wins you the game. You will play Might of Oaks. I predict that. Titania's Song is the final 4-drop in the cube. Like I said, there are 20 plus a couple of more artifacts in this cube, but there are 20 non-creature artifacts all totaled that you can make into creatures with Titania's Song, and that is just enough, in my experience, to make it worth it some of the time, especially if you have some of the more expensive artifacts. Now we got 13 5-drops in the entirety of the cube. Again, I'm not convinced it's enough, but in testing it's been, I guess the word is fine. We've got Defiler of Vigor up here first, man. This is just a 5 mana 6/6 trample, which is in some ways good enough, but this can also reduce the cost of your permanent spells in green, effectively making it ramp, and it can also make your dudes larger every single time you cast a green permanent. So this thing is another good way of getting through stalemates, which is an incredibly important thing to do in green. You'll see that a few of our 5-drops especially are ways of getting through stalemates, but a lot of our slots throughout the entire rest of the cube, from the 5 to the 7-drop slot, are dedicated to making sure that we can get out of jams and stalemates. So with that in mind, let's also look at Greensleeve's Morrow Sorcerer. 5 mana with protection from planeswalkers and from wizards. It's cool. It has power and toughness equal to the number of lands that you control, and it has landfall make a 3/3. So this is another one of the first real landfall signifiers that we've seen in this cube, but it's also one of the best. This thing can get just enormous, and most importantly, it can make a bunch of power toughness for you if you have some ramp. Apart from that, there's Swag Tusk, baby. This is a card that I've loved a lot back in my day, just 15 years ago. It wasn't that long ago, right? But yeah, 5 mana mana for a 5-power guy that gains 5 life when it ETBs and leaves behind a 3/3 is just good value. Verdurous Gearhulk is an artifact that's going to matter for a few things, but it's also just a 5 mana 4/4 trample that's going to effectively put 8 power and toughness onto the table. Great for +1/+1 counter decks. There's also Garrick's Pack Leader. This is a little bit expensive, but it also ends up drawing you a ton of cards over the course of the game. It's no Beast Whisperer, but especially in conjunction with Beast Whisperer, you start playing large creatures and things get really nasty really fast. Cockatrice is in here. It's got a whole app named after it. If you've a free Magic the Gathering deck testing app, if you've never heard of it, it's ancient at this point and the user interface is a little bit wonky, but it's still there, baby. But Cockatrice is good for the flying decks. First of all, there's not a whole lot of 5 mana flyers out there in the world, but it also has an effectively better form of Death Touch, so we'll play it some of the time. Quesa's in here to give all our green creatures +1/+1. Cool, including Quesa, by the way. So this is actually a 3/4 for 5 mana. This is another beat up card, but I love the way it looks. Acidic Slime is in here to blow up all kinds of stuff, artifacts, enchantments, lands. It's also a Death Touch guy for that deck. Renin 7, our first Planeswalker, ladies and gentlemen. But this one does a lot of stuff. It can put cards in our graveyard. It can put lands in our hand. This can make a dude for a couple of turns, right? It does a bunch of stuff. And I didn't want to leave Planeswalkers entirely out of this cube. We have a couple in here. There's also Frail Ice. Again, we have a couple in here. This is, I think, the most expensive card in the cube. I believe it has that distinction. Things like Worldly Tutor and even Sylvan Library were originally in here, but I decided to power it down some, especially considering those 2 cards individually were way too strong. Frail Ice is not too strong, and it's not anywhere near as expensive as the other couple of cards like Sylvan Library, Worldly Tutor, right? You can get this for a decent price right now. And it helps out the Elves decks. And not only does it help out the Elves decks, it's just a very, very strong Planeswalker in its own right. So I'm playing it in my cube. Shamanic Revelation is in here too. Draw 6 cards. is how this sometimes works out. Even if it's draw 3, that works a good bit some of the time. Plow Under is in here. I really have thought about cutting this card multiple times from this cube, but I never actually have. I think a lot of people have either fond or frustrating memories of Plow Under from their youth, so I apologize if you just hate this card. I really do, but it is extremely annoying. Put 2 lands on top of their owner's library is a heartbreaking play for a lot of decks. Apart from that, final card in the 5s is Overrun here. So 5 mana for +3/+3 and trample on all your guys at sorcery speed will win tons of games of Magic. I won't call this a first pickable card, but I would pick it relatively early if you have the chance. Now, there are 15 cards in the 6 mana and up category before we get to the artifacts here, and we'll just start with the quintessential green draft card, everybody. It's Colossal Dreadmaw. Yeah, I had to take part in the meme, but it also turns out that a 6 mana 6/6 trample is, you'll kind of take that, right? A lot of the time, I promise you'll take that. Force of Nature is also in here, though. This is 6 mana for an 8/8 trample. That's even better. And Swamp Thing over here, baby, is one of the more iconic cards from my youth. And I know a lot of boomers are going to appreciate the inclusion of this card. So let's teach the new generation how broken Force of Nature can be, especially when there's not a whole lot of great removal options. Autumn Willow is in here, another sort of callback to my youth that is nowhere near as good as it used to be, but this can't be hit by a fight effect or anything like that. And you can also, you can unshroud it. You can, for 1 green mana, give it hexproof instead of shroud, so you can suit it up with stuff if you wanted to, that's pretty cool. But I'll still take an effectively hexproof creature with a relatively big body, and Autumn Willow's still really pretty. She's a pretty lady. But there's also Destructor Dragon in here, so 6 mana for a 4/4 flyer. Now, this can destroy a non-creature permanent when it comes into play, which is technically the best part of the card, but the other best part is that it's a Sarah Angel, right? It's an air elemental, it's a 4 mana or a 6 mana 4/4 flyer, and that'll win games of Limited, especially when there are so few other flying creatures in the format. We've also got Yugun, the Rising Star, in here. This is 6 mana for a 5/5 dragon with flying, and when it dies, you can distribute 5 +1/+1 counters among any number of creatures. So again, not a whole lot of exile in the mono green cube, you are almost certain to spread these counters around. But what you're really looking at here is a 5/5 flyer that ends games of limited. You'll take that a lot of the time. Stormcloud Vanguard is in here. It can be a big creature, but can also blow up artifacts and enchantments. I like that kind of utility, so she's in. Apart from that, Jidit Ojanen of Efrava, another extremely broken must-kill on-site thing. But again, I told you, some of these cards are going to be devoted to ending stalemates, and Jedit does that. This is one of the most first-pickable cards in the whole cube, mark my words. It might cost 6 mana for just a 5/5, but it has Forest Walk itself, and whenever it attacks or blocks, you get a 2/2 Green Cat Warrior creature token with Forest Walk. So, you understand that you're going to win the game after like 2 turns of not only attacking with him but getting cats every turn. If you can just hold off your opponent and not die yourself, you have an unblockable 5 power and then an unblockable 7 power and then an unblockable 9 power, which should win you the game. But in any case, we'll move on to Desert Twister, which may cost 6 mana at sorcery speed, but if you wanted removal, this is removal. Destroy anything. You can destroy a land, you can destroy a creature, you can destroy an enchantment, it could even be a boat. It could even be a boat. Destroy anything you want to with a Desert Twister, and that is worth playing. Storm the Festival is in here. I went with this over Genesis Wave. I had my options. I had my choices. But I figured Storm the Festival was in some ways not only the more fun and powerful card, depending on the situation. I mostly also didn't want Genesis Wave. I didn't want elves to have access to Genesis Wave. I'll admit that. But still, Storm the Festival is a fun card that be cast multiple times in a game. Thorn Elemental, a lot of us learned that this card was not as good as we thought it was way back in the day, but in a format where there's not a lot of good removal and there is a ton of great ramp so you can get to this card ahead of schedule, I think Thorn Elemental gets a whole lot better. So not only does this help rep Urza's Destiny, one of my favorite sets of all time with this amazing art, it's super Timmy card from way back in the day that a lot of us loved and learned lessons off of. I think it's actually pretty decent in this cube as well. Titan of Industry is in here, man. You remember this from Standard last year, and it may strike some fear into your heart. This does tons of stuff. The shield counter is especially important in this environment, but apart from that, creating an extra body or blowing something up, this is all stuff that you want to be able to do. Hornet Queen is in here, maybe the most intimidating flyer in the entire cube. It may just look like a 2/2 flying death touch, but when it ETBs, you actually get 6 power and toughness on 5 bodies. All of it has flying and death touch. So this thing is absolutely ridiculous. This is another one where, like, even though it's 7 mana, I think a lot of decks will be fighting to play it. Enray's Forerunners, not Craterhoof Behemoth, but the next best thing, and it costs way less money-wise than a Craterhoof does, so it's in here, man. Another way of ending stalemates right then and there pretty easily. Genesis Hydra is our first X-cost creature in the deck. Again, no Genesis Wave, but that doesn't mean we won't play Genesis Hydra. You know, you're only getting like one thing off Genesis Hydra, and I think that's fine. Final green creature in the deck is Corbis Harvest Celebrant, which is really good for the +1/+1 counter decks especially. But again, any deck can play this. It may be a little bit below curve, almost no matter how much mana you're pouring into it, but a dedicated ramp deck could easily play this in the very late game and just have an 8/8, which they're into. But now we move on to the artifacts. There are 20 of these in here, as stated earlier, and some of them are going to look a little bit wonky. Like, for instance, Nurok Hover Sail. This is just a 1 mana, enchantment equipment that gives a creature flying and equips for 2 mana. Kind of busted, it turns out, in a mono green cube. Giving anything flying is a great ability when you have so many large creatures and so few flyers. Emerald Medallion is in here in case you want a little bit of ramp. That should provide an awful lot of it to you. There's Moss Diamond. If you want a little bit of ramp, this will provide exactly that much to you. Apart from that, there's Mind Stone. Even less ramp technically because you're not actually getting green mana, but this one draws you cards, which is something you're going to be looking for in these decks. Maze Mind Tome, speaking of drawing cards, boy, I ordered this the way I did for a reason, didn't I? Yeah, if you want to draw cards, Maze Mind Tome will help you do that. It's a good piece. Limbas is in here along with Golden Egg. These are both foods for the food deck, but Limbus also draws cards, as does Golden Egg, but Limbus is kind of a perma food, which I do like for those decks. Worm's Tooth is in here. Again, mono green life gain is not necessarily an archetype that's supported by any important cards in this cube, but sometimes you just want to gain a little bit of life, and with all of your opponents, maybe you're playing a, a four on whatever it is, a 2-on-2. Maybe you're playing a 4-player game, but even in a 1v1, most cards played are going to be green, so this will gain you a ton of life over the course of the game. There's also Simian Simulacrum in here. So this is a 3-mana 2-1, which doesn't look great, but it can get creatures huge, and it can unearth, and it can put the counters on itself. Just a great card. There's also Livecraster's Bestiary, one of the best artifacts, from my experience at least, in this entire cube. This draws a ton of cards. Even if there's a mana commitment involved, you'll still draw a bunch of cards off of it. Hilda's Crown of Winter is a weird one, but this is effectively a removal spell, like an Icy Manipulator or something for a deck like this. Also draws cards some of the time, and draws a lot of them other times. Unstable Obelisk is a rock, so it's a 3-mana thing that taps for mana. Ramp is important, but if you have enough mana, this can just blow up anything. a whole permanent, and we want that here. Solemn Simulacrum is in here. Sad Robo is maybe the softest slot in the artifacts, but you want a ramp in green. Why not play this? It also draws you cards on a body. Masticore is busted, and I probably should cut it from the artifacts because, as I've said, with maybe 3 cards so far, this is one of the more first pickable cards in the entire cube. I'd say there's a top 5 or 6 most first pickable cards. This is definitely among those. You know, you have to pitch a card to it every turn, but it's still removal. Now, there are going to be a ton of creatures that you can't take down with this because they're like 7/7s and you don't have 14 mana, but you can still largely, control your opponent's supply of, 1 to 3 or 4 toughness dudes fairly easily with a Masticore, and that usually means you win the game. Icy Manipulator, mentioned just a second ago, so, of course it's here. This can tap down lands, which is really frustrating, but for the most part, this is just removal on your opponent's largest dude every turn, so long as you kept a mana up, and you'll be happy that you did. We've also got Oblivion Stone in here, as well as Nevinriel's Disc, or Larry Nevin's Disc. These are both just artifacts that blow everything on the table up, which I think is obviously very powerful in a cube like this, but a pretty necessary effect too. My least favorite thing about these is that very often you blow them up, and the game effectively restarts, and things can get slightly boring as both players are just kind of top decking from then on out. But all that said, even with that effect on, the game state, I still think these are important cards to have access to as panic buttons for when a player gets a little bit too far behind in terms of ramp or board presence, right? So there's a reason they're in here. I think they belong here. There's also maybe my favorite artifact in this whole cube, guys. This is a slick one. It's Duplicant. So in case you've never seen this does cost 6 mana, but when it comes into play, you can remove a non-token creature from the game, and Duplicant effectively becomes a copy of that thing, right? So that's kind of neat. It has the creature's power, toughness, and creature types. Now, it doesn't end up getting, the creature's abilities or anything like that, obviously, but you're still you're taking away perhaps like an 8/8 from your opponent's side of the table, and you're getting your own 8/8. So this is not only a removal spell, it's also a body, and the body tends to be very large. Much better card than it appears to be. There's also Triskelion. This is 6 mana, but it comes equipped with 3+1/+1 counters, and you can take those counters off of it at no cost to zap things for a damage. And that's just removing any +1/+1 counters. So in a +1/+1 counter deck that's putting a ton of them on your guys, then suddenly Triskelion becomes a pretty solid source of removal, and even just like going face and winning the game is a potential likelihood with the Triskelion. So it really supports those decks. And then finally for the artifacts, Meteor Golem. It is a very meaty golem. Is it meteor? Maybe, but this is just another thing that blows up a permanent. That's something that green just doesn't have the ability to do super often, so we'll take it on Golem. And finally, there are 10 lands in total in this cube here, starting with Heart of Yavimaya. I was pretty excited to get to play this one because I think it's a beautiful magic card, but it's also just a solid magic card. You have to sack a forest when it comes into play, but it taps for green, and it's untapped when it comes into play. You can also tap it to give a creature +1/+1 till end of turn. It doesn't seem like much, but you'd be surprised sometimes how often that +1/+1 will save your bacon or do the extra damage you need to help win the game. Pendlehaven is in here. It'd be silly silly if it weren't, right? This is another one of the more expensive cards in the cube, but there are less expensive versions of Pendlehaven than the original Legends one. But God, isn't it gorgeous? Isn't that a gorgeous Magic card to pick up from Legends? I'm pretty sure you can get it for less than $10 right now. You should probably get it. Plus, you know, giving a dork +1/+2 is also pretty relevant some of the time. And this just takes the place of a forest in your deck. It comes into play untapped, and it taps for green. Might as well play it, right? Just really good land. Treetop Village, the good one, the good looking one from Urza's Legacy. Really, really fantastic art on this one, but also a great, you know, man land for creature land, whatever you want to call them, for any mono green deck. And creature lands are, you know, there's no sweepers or anything in this environment, but there is a ton of sorcery speed removal. It's Enchantress, it's enchantment based, or it's literally on a sorcery speed card, right? So creature lands are pretty important to have access to in this environment because they're not entirely, you know, immune to removal, but more so than a lot of the other creatures we have access to. There's also Jungle Basin from Visions. This is one of those bounce lands that creates 2 mana once you know, have it in play, but you have to bounce a land when it does come into play. That's entirely fine. You'll bounce a land, you see, and then play it again, and that is a landfall trigger, so you play it in those decks. Blighted Woodland is in here. Speaking of landfall triggers, this can sacrifice to effectively cast an explosive vegetation, so you want to do that. There's also Myriad Landscape. It does a very similar thing. This can go get a couple of basic lands and just throw them onto the table. That's good for landfall. It's also just good for ramp. Mistress Factory is another, you know, creature land type thing that we can play in here. Blast Zone is yet another sweeper, just like Navimriel's Disc or Oblivion Stone, but this one gets to be in the mana base. And Quicksand is the next to last land in here. This is, again, effectively a removal spell that can remove small creatures at the cost of a land. You'll take that some of the time, but the final card in the cube is the best land. Look, this one is the most expensive card, I think, in the entire cube. It could be that Freyalice is slightly more expensive, but Maze of Ith is in here. This card will cost you, I think, around $15 from the dark right now. A moderately played copy like the one you see before you should be somewhere between $10 and $12, which I suggest picking up. But Maze of Ith does not have to be in here. You could go with another utility land if you wanted to, or another green land, whatever you wanted to do. Maybe add a card to the 5-drops like I was talking about earlier. There's all kinds of things you could do with this slot, but I find that Maze of Ith is a obviously amazing utility land, especially in a format with not a whole lot of removal. This basically just, you know, blanks your opponent's largest creature every turn. It's a great thing to be able to do. This is a holdover from the Turbo Fog deck that I mentioned earlier. But that said, even though that deck mostly got cut, all the bad stuff got cut. The good cards remain, and Maze of Ith is one of those. Now, just because we're done with this video doesn't mean that we're done with mono-colored cubes. We're not even close, right? We're not even halfway through at this point. We got red, white, and blue to choose from, and I'm not going to tell you which one I want to do the most because I don't want to skew anything. There's going to be another poll pretty soon. That said, that poll will very likely take place over on Bluesky. I've had my account for a couple of weeks now, been having fun over there, and I've got some followers, but I'd like some more. So check me out on Bluesky. Follow me over there. And within a week or so after I upload this video, I'll be putting out that poll. So vote for monocolored red, white, or blue cubes over there, and you can affect the course of YouTube history. Apart from that, the actual most important thing about this outro is that now I want to know what you think, right? Like anything that you would have put in your cube, whether it's in or out of budget, I want to know about. There were probably close to 200 other cards that I really looked at hard to include in this cube, and some heartbreaking cuts I had to make at the end of the day. So if there's something you think really should have been in here, it's pretty likely that I considered it too, and maybe we can have a little discussion about it down there in the comments section. Apart from that, last words here, just remember that I have a Patreon, link in the description. But anyway, that's about it though. Just let me know how you felt about everything, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.